he has written a book, and he has the books over here if you'd like to purchase one later on. But the part that I wanted him to speak to you about tonight was his experiences during the Second World War. And if he is capable or willing, maybe next year, if you're still here, you will perhaps address us about your fantastic career and your life in Mexico, where you did a lot of work for the missions. Yeah. I have to tell you that Henry's wife passed away today. So, but Henry has decided he would still like to speak to us. It's a mark of the man. He is truly remarkable. I think he tells me that what has kept him going through all these years is his tremendous faith, and I'm sure you will speak about that. Mm-hmm. So I give you Henry Vanderdort. Go ahead, Henry.
Well, you were talking about next year, and if I will be still around.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
14 years ago, when I turned 80, I started complaining to my pastor that I'm coming closer to the end of my life, and and I don't have all the energy and the strength anymore. And he said, "Hey, stop it," he said. Moses, he was 80 when he started his job, and he was 120 when he finished it. You have a long way to go. So I said, well, I hope the good Lord will not keep me here that long. But Moses had the same problem as I had. And he complained to God that I am not, that's the latest translation, I am not a good speaker, and I am clumsy with words. And I can identify with that very much. First of all, I am Dutch, and that's not much, and I had to learn 4 other languages, and so I got 5 of them mixed up in here. And often the word, either it doesn't come up until I wait for 2 or 3 minutes, or it comes up in the wrong language. And as long as my wife, up to 3 years ago, she was always with me in Mexico and everywhere where if I was asked to speak, and then she was the one who straightened me out some kind of instantly, because she had 6 languages. She was born in Indonesia, and her second language, after Dutch, the second language was Malay, so she was 1 step ahead of me even. But anyway, I had to. So now the Lord came after Moses was complaining. Then the Lord said to him, well, Aaron can speak for you. And I had hoped that somebody could speak for me here tonight, but all they're doing is videoing me, I think, but I haven't seen any volunteers yet. So as I have been often by default have to step in and do it, and I'm here then by default now to give you a talk about what I have experienced in my life. Schools there for missionary kids, and it was in English. My Spanish at that time was not good enough anyway, and they asked me then to quite a few times at chapel service to give a word to the kids and give them a bit of an encouragement to stand on their own and to not to follow the crowd. But then there was this one couple, and they were with Bible translators, and he was the only Jewish one. And then when he found out that how we were India resistance involved with helping the Jews and what have you, him and his wife, they came to me and he said, you have to sit down and write a book. So anyway, I wrote actually my green book in Mexico, and I had the advantage then that his wife was a linguist, and she spent a full week with me smoothing things out. So if you read it, then don't give me the credit, give her the credit. But the rest of this, and then 10 years later, Or from then on, actually, when people read my book and they said, but now we want to hear what you are doing in Mexico, and you have to write the rest of the story. My memoirs then basically from World War II were what the Lord had done in my life and how my faith and character were shaped and in trusting the Lord and doing all that. Oh, my son here, if you don't mind. Historica Canada and the Memory Project, actually, they thought it was worth their while that at the time they put all except for the first page, which was all about the family background. They put that on the internet. They thought it worth their while. And the Dutch government actually 10 years ago, they were looking for stories of wartime stories of Dutch immigrants, and there are about 200,000 or 300,000 of them, and they were going to select 100 to put into a personal history memory book, and mine was one of the 100, and it's actually turned out to be the longest one. Most of them are only 1 or 2 pages, and mine is a full 5 pages. And in headlines, a boy raised in the fear of the Lord. Now, this is a secular book, and actually, Jesus Christ, the name of Jesus Christ is only mentioned once in this book, and this is in my story. So I was very much very happy to see that they had not cut out any of my Christian witness parts of the story. And their introduction I didn't read that, their introduction was a boy raised in the fear of the Lord, from the memoirs of Henry Vanderdort, a boy raised in the fear of the Lord as he identifies himself. A passage has been chosen in which the author described his hazardous adventure as a line crosser in 1944, when part of the Netherlands had been liberated. As Henry's deepest motivation can only be explained from his very specific background as a son of the Orthodox Protestant community of the islands in the southwest part of the country, his line crosser story is preceded by the author's description of his family background. So then they started off right at the beginning, but I had also started in 1892. That's my grandparents from both sides left the state church to join the Christian Reformed Church and the Orthodox group of the churches, which ultimately was only about 10% of the population of the country, but they were became the heart of the Dutch resistance, actually. A summary of my early years' history. I was born in 1924 in Holland to a church-going Christian family. From 1930 to 1939, I attended Christian schools where I learned to trust and obey God and have the security of eternal life through Jesus Christ. There was never any doubt in my mind that this was the only way for me. It was, however, all in my head and not much in my heart. When I was 15 years old, World War II started. My introduction to war was the bombing of Rotterdam on May the 14th, 1940, and our village just outside Rotterdam, and a fighter plane attack on a refugee truck that I was driving. I survived both without a scratch. That night I realized I needed Jesus Christ for forgiveness of sins and to open the door of heaven in case I would not survive the next time. As a teenager, I experienced a growing faith that gave me peace of mind and the courage to be one of a small minority who resisted the Nazis. And when I refused to work as a slave laborer in Germany in 1942, when all Dutch 18-year-olds were called up, I became an outlaw without identity papers and food rations for 2 years. In 1944, when the Allied German front line approached our village, I decided to join the armed partisans in the marshes and ultimately the Allied armies. It was risky to do because if caught, I would be executed. But I had the death penalty already hanging over my head for 4 years by that time. So one more that didn't do any harm. Crossing the front line under German fire, I made a solemn vow: if God would bring me safely back to my father's house, I would serve him for the rest of my life and mankind for the rest of my life. And that's what brought us into 33 years of working mostly in Mexico. That's what brings me now into extended care, so helping, encouraging people there. When the war ended, so joining the British Army, I ended up as a platoon sergeant by default. Again, we lost the sergeant, and they pointed at me, the youngest one, to take over. And in the British Army, and then after the Germans surrendered, they turned me over to the Canadian Army, who trained me in Wales for Japanese jungle fight training, and we were on our way to the Far East when they threw the atom bomb on Japan and probably saved my life and 500,000 other Allied soldiers. But when the war ended, I found my immediate family on the 8th, 1945, when the Germans surrendered, all safe and sound in my father's house. The Lord had honored my vow, and I knew I better do my part. And when the going was tough, sometimes in Mexico and sometimes dangerous, all I had to do is think back of the vow that they made. And I told school children sometimes too, you make a promise, do you have to keep it? And they said, yes. I said, if you have to make a promise to the Lord, do you have? Oh, of course. So that was what kept me going when the going was tough. And then I married my wife, Mary, in 1950, 67 years ago now, and we immigrated to Canada. From the moment we arrived in Canada, we were involved in helping new arrivals and supporting churches and Christian schools. We experienced God's blessing in family life, health, work, and financial resources so that we could comfortably retire in 1983. And since 1983, then we have been volunteering in mission posts, mostly during the winter season. The first 7 years, we worked in New Mexico and Arizona. And then in December 1989, I was sent to Mexico to organize the construction of a medical clinic at the Totonac Bible School in La Union, Puebla. And from then on, we stayed in Mexico because we saw the need, and we were kind of half of the time with the Wycliffe Bible translators, but often just freelancing and just see where we needed us in from one project and from one area to another. That's been the most blessed time of our life, both Mary and I, even now that she was in extended care. That we often were thinking and talking about that and what a blessing it had become to us that we both felt that we had lived life to the fullest. So I served, as you heard, in 4 armies: the Dutch Resistance, the British Army, and ended up then as a sergeant, the Canadian. And when the Japanese surrendered, And then the Canadian Army had no use for me anymore, and they turned me over to the new Dutch Army, and I became an instructor for the troops that were being sent to Indonesia and the Far East to take over from the Japanese who were still in the different islands. But I did not go there myself. Now, the question is why? Why did I go through all of this? And most of the people like here in Canada and even in England too, when they volunteered for the services, it was because of adventure, patriotism, and or other just a regular income. But for us, it was a holy war. In May of 1930, as a 6-year-old, I started grade 1 of the school with the Bible. The inscription over the entrance says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." For me, that was the theme of the teachings that I received during the next 6 years at school, at home, and in church. Getting to know the will of the God of the Bible, learning reverence for Him, and to trust and obey Him in all phases of life. There was never any doubt in my mind that this was the only way for me. I was taught to dare to be different, to stand alone, if necessary, and in order to do the Lord's will, like Gideon, David, and Daniel, who were my heroes. In the second half of the 1930s, our small Orthodox church contributed a lot to preparing me for our upcoming struggle against the Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler, as did our Christian newspapers and radio. In sermons, catechism classes, and young people's meetings, we heard what was going on in Germany. Anyone who read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, knew that he was out to conquer the world with his German Superman. It was obvious that he wanted to enslave inferior people like the East European Slavs and rid himself of the Jews, the Gypsies, and the disabled. And I might add here that my two older brothers were disabled and crippled, so it came very much so home to us that what we were going to be up to, and this is actually what happened in Germany, that they were being done away with. Anyone in our denomination back in 1934, membership in the Dutch Nazi Party meant first censure and ultimately excommunication. They realized very much more than the churches in Germany did. I was just reading Bonhoeffer's book again, and how only a very, very small section of the German and the German churches were actually, and the people were aware of what was going on, and the pastors in the churches they had to swear allegiance to Hitler, and for us it was just the opposite. So, but still, also in our country, when the Nazis were very much aware of the fact that most of the opposition in Holland would come from the extreme right, the Orthodox Christians, with some from the extreme left, the communists. I have heard stories that when they began the resistance, and when they were going out for a raiding project, or mostly the distribution centers and food supplies, then the communists went on their knees for prayer before they all went out with the Christians. Therefore, when they invaded the country, the Nazis rounded up our church and political leaders as hostages and closed down Christian newspapers, radio, and labor unions. They also infiltrated our Christian schools by appointing German language teachers who functioned as spies. 5% of the population were members of the Dutch Nazi Party and collaborated with the enemy. The vast majority of the people obeyed the occupation government, 90%, afraid of punishment. 5%, increasing to 10% by the end of the war, became actively involved in the resistance, the underground, or went into hiding, divers. The resistance became active in hiding and feeding Jews and others who were thought by the enemy, including Allied airmen. I got involved in smuggling food for people in hiding and in the distribution of illegal underground newspapers. Actually, my first act of resistance was 5 days after our army surrendered in May 40 by stealing a truck from the German army and painting it over in civilian colors and using it for the resistance. I might not get around to it in those details, but when I came home, and I hadn't told anybody about it because I was afraid that they would try to discourage me of doing that. And my father was rather proud when he found out. My mother was horrified. She said, they are shooting boys for stealing bicycles and even bicycle tires. And here you're stealing a truck. I said, yes, Mom, but the penalty was the same. So I wanted to make it worth my while. And I said, furthermore, the German guards were looking for boys at the back fences, climbing the back benches. They weren't looking for a boy going out the front gate with a truck. So I was well thought out. But in our churches, we discussed at length biblical principles in view of Nazi doctrine and practices. If we had to choose between love for our oppressed and persecuted fellow man and love for our enemy, which Jesus Christ also often mentioned, loving the oppressed and saving their lives should prevail. Sometimes you have to make a choice. You cannot have both. This would justify misleading, like using false identification papers, lying to and harming the enemy. And that's what saved my life. A pastor's wife lying to the Germans that they had seen anybody, while seconds before they had thrown the door open and got my friend and me through their house and were hiding us. But she, like Rahab in Jericho, denied that she'd seen anybody, and in doing that, saved our life and probably also her husband and herself. So harming the enemy, that would even include killing traitors, not out of revenge. I was there when they ground two Dutch traitors, SS traitors, when it was in the marches with I didn't do it myself, but I was there when it happened. Not out of revenge, but to prevent further harm. And then our biblical example was Rahab of Jericho, one of the heroes of faith of Hebrews 11, who misled her own people to save the Israelite spies. To us, fighting the Nazis was a just and holy war. It was our duty to resist the enemy with all means and help the oppressed, including the Jews. We started to take more and more risks, though many got caught, others quickly took their places. Prayer was our companion, day and night. But our churches were full, but even there it could be dangerous, as the Nazis occasionally raided them. I was sitting in the back of our church, sometimes close to the organ. We had a big organ with a little door in it that they could escape if they would come, in the time that I was an outlaw. And sometimes they couldn't go to church at all. But even there, it could be dangerous, as the Nazis occasionally raided them. In the largest city churches, they sometimes had a traitor, but the people didn't know each other. The country churches where we were, everybody knew each other, but there are sometimes a traitor listening in to betray the minister if he warned against Nazi practices or prayed for the Queen or the Jews or people in hiding. approximately 20% of the pastors in our denomination, that's 106 out of a total of 500, 20%, spent time in jail or concentration camps. Reverend Thunderman, a cousin of my mother and pastor of a large church in Groningen city, spoke out against Hitler during a church service. He was picked up the next day by the SS, the Gestapo, and he died in Dachau concentration camp. A total of 20 did not survive the concentration camps of our. So that was catechism classes came to an end since curfew time, and at first at 10 p.m. was gradually moved to 7 p.m. Furthermore, travel in pitch dark streets was dangerous. I made a hideout under the wooden floor of my bedroom. But the Nazi search parties got wise after a while and started shooting through wooden floors and walls. So I had to extend my hideout to as far as under the granite and concrete floor of the hallway, where I had some straw and a blanket, that nothing would wake me up at night except the noise of a truck in the street, which at that time could only be German. And when the truck stopped, I was in my hideout in a flash. Fortunately, we never had a search. Shortly after we married in December of 1950, my wife Mary asked me one morning, "Why did you jump out of bed and start running in the middle of the night?" I told her I had no recollection of it, but it must have been that a vehicle stopped in front of the house. It's still there in my brain. And this morning, I told actually in extended care when I was sleeping in a cot beside my wife's bed to one of the PSWs. She came in and then she said, "How come can you, even if you fall asleep, how can you still keep watch on your wife?" I said, "I'm tuned in to her breathing, and if that varies, I will be awake in a flash, and I can do something about it." It's still in my mind. Oh yes, at the same time when they bombed Rotterdam, at the same time they bombed our village. I was in my grandparents' house next door to ours when the bombs started falling around us. We were all praying as we saw the walls and ceiling moving, and we expected them to collapse on top of us at any time. When the bombing stopped, we went outside to inspect the damage, and there was a lot of broken windows and tiles. The house beside, at 3 houses away from us, beside my wife's mother's home, was completely destroyed. We saw Rotterdam burning in the distance, and many people were afraid that another wave of bombs was on the way. We decided to flee to the countryside. My father wasn't home, but his truck was, one of his remaining trucks. And I used the 2-ton truck as a 15-year-old to transport several loads of refugees, including my own family and some of the neighbors and Mary's family. My wife Mary was one 9-year-old. She was one of on the load to farms a few kilometers away. On my return after the last trip, I drove on the open dike road when a German fighter plane spotted my vehicle, a Messerschmitt 109, one of those fastest planes at the time, and started diving with the obvious intent of strafing the cabin. Facing death, I cried out my first real prayer, "Lord, save me." I cut the ignition, put on the emergency brake, opened the door, rolled out of the still moving vehicle down the slope of the dike. Even doing this, I could have easily been hit by a strafing bullet. But the Lord heard my prayer. The attacker skimmed over my truck but did not pull the trigger. And then that night, I mentioned it already. Then I gave my heart. Said, Lord Jesus, I surrender to you, and if next time I don't make it, open the door of heaven to me. And he opened the door of heaven for my wife today. So, anyway, that was after that I got more and more involved with all kind of uh, distribution of illegal underground papers, food for people in hiding, and later on, and I used my truck to go to the farms to pick up food there, and there was always German inspectors there because they were trying to take everything into Germany and let us go hungry. But then when the inspector had to go to the bathroom or the farmer's daughters got them to come inside for a cup of coffee, then they were hiding all the wheat and everything that they were threshing uh, under the straw. And then at night, I came with my truck and had to pick it all up. And then I started processing it we had our own little grinder and a press, an oil press. But the only thing is we didn't have electricity enough because everybody was only allowed two 30-watt light bulbs for a few hours every night. And if you used more than that and showed up on the meter, you were being cut off. So I was used needed volumes of electricity. So actually, one night as a 16, 17-year-old, I climbed the roof with a pair of tongs. I didn't have insulated pliers, and I might have grabbed them with a rag, and I started undoing the connection with the power line, but the insulation wasn't quite good enough, and and with the result, I had a big flash, and I blew the, the transformer fuses of the whole neighborhood, and in the meantime, so they were German inspectors or German paid inspectors were going around everywhere finding out what had happened and eventually restoring the power. But it took an hour. In the meantime, I ignored everything and I was working hacking into the wall and bypassing the meter. So by the time they had the power back on, I was finished too, and I had all the electricity I needed for the rest of the war. Just, I still remember that my dad didn't quite know what I had been doing, and I was still in the army. And then my father felt kind of guilty after the war ended that he was still not paying for the electricity. So he called the local electrician, and he had a hard time finding out what I had done. But eventually he restored it. So those are the kind of things that I was doing. June the 6th, 1944, the Allied forces landed in Normandy, and I decided to join them as a volunteer as soon as possible, rather than taking the risk of being rounded up by the Germans as a slave laborer. And by then, our island had become isolated, well, surrounded by water, and the ferries and the one bridge, they were tightly controlled by the Germans, and everybody had to have identification papers. Of course, I didn't have them anymore, and I couldn't, and so I couldn't. I was kind of stuck on the island for quite a while. But I wanted to attempt to cross the front lines to join the Allied armies, and I tried to find one or more companions. The Germans had stepped up the rounding up of men since they desperately needed slave laborers to work both in Germany and locally to dig ditches. Line crossers, what's called then, who wanted to cross the front lines, were a loss to them and a gain for the Allies, so they were executed when caught to set an example. No wonder I could not find anyone either at school or in Strijd to make the attempt. I finally decided to go alone. And I knew that if I could reach the marsh area east of the bridges, I could join up with the armed resistance force, the partisans, and then work my way south into Brabant. This meant crossing a total of 4 rivers, but it was less risky than crossing the 3-kilometer wide Holland river directly south of us. But later on, 3 months after I had gone already, there was a group of and they banded together from my hometown who at Christmas time were going to cross the front lines. They figured the Germans were all in celebrating Weihnachten and there would be very little patrols and they would probably be able to make it. They were all caught, all 16 of them. 2 or 3 of them were Allied pilots and they went to the prisoner of war camps. The others were picked up by the Gestapo and some of them were already were shot on sight. And the guys from my home country, from my hometown, they were executed as a warning for people going against the Germans. So when I came back the next year in May, finally, I was the only survivor that came back alive, the only one who came back alive in my hometown. The ones who were being executed, they have streets and a plaza named after them. The one that was successful didn't get any recognition, but it didn't bother me. Disorganized German soldiers in retreat found themselves trapped at the river and in between the bridges. The bridges were too far for them. The local fishermen in the village of Drimmelen offered them their rowboats and told them that on the other side they would find a German army unit. Instead, they were taken prisoner by the resistance and locked up on 2 barges, which were camouflaged in the marshes close to where we arrived in our rowboat. We were told to follow the trail for approximately 1 hour, and by the prisoners were taken, and then we could help out while waiting for our final crossing. And but then after that, then one night. That was one of the prisoners managed to escape and reported to a German unit in the city. And a message was received to us that the German raid was organized to wipe out the partisans and free the prisoners. An American and a British pilot who had now joined the group recommended that the prisoners be killed and the partisans go into hiding as they did not have a chance in combat. A courier was sent by us to the city, and he came back with the ingredients to gas all of the prisoners inside the barges when the raiding party came close. Fortunately, we arrived a message that the raiding party was annihilated on the bridge by the British Air Force. But we kept watching the other side of the river, not only for individual soldiers, but also for another raiding party. One night, the German bullets from across the river just missed my face. And I remember that Jacob, on his first night away from home, as he fled from his brother, made a vow at Bethel. And I did the same. If God will be with me and watch over me so that I shall return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God and I will serve him for the rest of my life. It seems to me now that my faith was not quite strong enough to make an unconditional promise to the Lord. A few times, in fact, in those months away from home, I thought it necessary to remind the Lord of my vow when being shelled with 2 V2s coming down in Brabant and Brussels and Antwerp and crossing minefields on foot and by ship. and an ammunition depot that blew up when I was just outside of it. Another time, I was taking shells to the front line with my platoon, which happened to be just south of the river, while my folks on the other side. I was more concerned about their safety at that time than mine. Every grenade that went through my hands, I prayed that it wouldn't harm my folks. There was damage done there, I found out later, but they were themselves not hurt. The source of overcoming my fear, apart from prayer, was the Bible, and in particularly the Psalms of David. Now, when the war broke out in 1939, at Christmas, my folks gave me this pocket Bible, and that was the only personal object that I owned when I was in the army. I always carried it in my front pocket. Fortunately, it did not have to stop any bullets, but so it is still more on it, but it's still very deep. Now, the next morning, after this happened, when I made my vow, there was nobody to be seen on the riverside of the dike, and the partisan in charge asked for volunteers to check out the other side to see if the Germans had withdrawn, and hopefully learn that the British had arrived. My friend Jan and I volunteered to go, and we took one of the rowboats across the river. We left our bicycles on the other side on the shore, climbed the dike, and discovered a company of Germans in the field having their breakfast. So we realized we couldn't take the risk of rowing back across the river to get out as fast as possible. So we signaled back to the partisans that things were not safe yet and got away as fast as possible. Entering the next town of Geertruidenberg, through a street with identical townhouses on it, we stopped the first person that we met. We found out that the British were approaching the town from two directions, and we were trapped between cracked German SS units. At that very moment, a German foot patrol spotted us from a distance and started running towards us. Two geese hanging from our bikes and the mud on our clothes were a clear indication that we were the right age, that we had come from the partisan marsh area. We realized that we were in great danger and only a miracle could save us. I asked the man who had stopped us, who we had stopped, if perhaps there was a Protestant minister in this predominantly Catholic town, knowing that most pastors could be trusted and that many were involved in hiding fugitives. Yes, the man said, Reverend Visser lives right across the street by number 30. And we rushed across, and miraculously the door flew wide open. We went through the hall and kitchen and out the back door, bikes and all, led by the pastor and his daughter, while the pastor's wife closed the front door and started mopping up our muddy tracks. The German patrol could not see from a distance into which identical door we had disappeared, so they started searching and questioning. Mrs. de Visser, like Rahab in Jericho of old, denied having seen any strangers, and the pursuers finally gave up and just reported the incident. Next, a loudspeaker van went through town announcing that any male found on the streets would be shot on sight. We were indeed well trapped. Meanwhile, our rescuers took us through back lanes to the home of the Else house on Cow Street, where we stayed in hiding in a fruit cellar for 5 days. That night, I realized that the Lord had heard my prayer and vow and that He was already doing His part. So, after that, then, after 5 days of bombardments and shelling, the Germans withdrew, and we met the Polish tank division, part of the Second British Army, and and on top of a triumphantly we ended Geertruidenberg on top of a Polish tank. And then we could go on with our bicycles, and 2 days later signed up as war volunteers with the Allied armies. So I often ask people what it took for Canadians to volunteer with the army. I said, well, time-wise, it took us only 2 hours. We had to go to the next recruiting station and signed up, and then we had a beer and went back home until we were called up. I said, well, if you ask me what was your most dangerous part of your military career, then for me it was to get to the recruiting station. So I joined up then, and with the British Army we got a quick 6 weeks training in Brussels, and then we had to join as pioneers to support the frontline troops with building bridges over the rivers and supplies, ammunition and food supplies, fixing roads and everything. Although we were all armed, in doing that you always had your rifle, your loaded rifle with you. But then after 3 weeks, they gave me one stripe already because they were in dire need of NCOs and corporals and sergeants. We only had a few British NCOs, and we had British officers, but for the rest, they were in dire need of the other ranks. So I was 6 weeks Lance Corporal, soldier first class. And then for 3 weeks later, they made me a corporal, and I had already 10 men work under me. And then we went into Germany with the platoon, and they lost the sergeant. And I was in a remote spot, and 2 captains came with 3 stripes, sergeant stripes. And they said, you have to come with us because you're going to be a sergeant from now on. I said, I am not qualified. I'm the youngest of a 35-man platoon. Some of them are married. And I said, I only had a few weeks. I'm less than 3 months in the army. I know how to shoot and how to salute, but that's about all. And they said, well, you've shown courage by being in the resistance, by coming through with the partisans, coming through the front line, showing leadership qualifications. You look much older than 20, and you speak high school English, and furthermore, we don't have anybody else. That's all I have to do. So that's the way I became a sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
My time is pretty well up, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think you've done very well. Thank you so much, Henry.
Yeah.
Do you remember the story with the motorcycle where you had to ride it? I remember reading in the book about the motorcycle, and you had never rode a motorcycle.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell that story?
Well, when I came home, that's right. After my training on this northern mountain
In Wales.
in England,
Mm.
and then for the first time I got a week's leave of absence, and I came home, hitchhiked home, I guess, and then my father said, "Oh," he said, "maar you have to go and pick up your sister, your younger sister, the one who's now in Edmonton, and she is just about 40 kilometers north of here with a cousin, and see if you can borrow a car." So I went to the garage holder. We knew him very well, and he said, "No, I don't have one, but I have a motorcycle." Do you know how to ride it? I said, "No, but I know how to. I've been riding bicycles since I was 3 years old, and I know how to drive trucks." And I said, "Show me." So he showed it to me, and I started. And by the time I came through on the outskirts of the city of Rotterdam. I was pretty familiar with it, and so I came, knocked on the door where my sister was, and she, I didn't know you could ride a bike. I said, an hour ago, I didn't know either. But now anybody could have done that.
Not so sure. Well, I want to thank you so much for speaking, particularly on the day, this day, when your dear wife has left this earth. Mike, would you thank for
No, we hear a lot of war stories in our lives, and recently the Academy Awards went to the film Dunkirk, where we saw tremendous, courageous.
Well, the truck that I stole was on its way to Dunkirk. That was my contribution
there-
for Dunkirk.
There you are.
Yes,
Well, what I'm going to tell you is your story is equally as courageous, and equally as interesting, and I've got just about as wrapped up as I can be, better than a movie. So thank you so much for that. You've mentioned that what struck me is your pocket Bible and the Psalms of David and the strength and the support that that's given to you, and that was a real that marvelous. You must have been a bad guy. Boy, you got into trouble all the time. But
I must have done something right.
you did everything right,
I'm not
apparently.
here.
That's right. The value I get out of it tonight is that it's good that we hear the stories of the bad deeds of the oppressors, and that we never let that get out of our minds, never forget it, so that it doesn't reoccur. I think that's important. Don't touch hydro wires. I think that's the other lesson. So, Henry, thank you very much.
Okay.
Andre has some books over there that